She was already dialing 911 when I stepped out of my car, and in that moment, I knew my quiet evening was over. I had just pulled into my own driveway after a long, exhausting day, thinking about dinner and rest, when a woman stormed across the sidewalk, phone raised, voice sharp enough to cut through the air. She pointed at me like I was a criminal caught in the act and loudly announced that she was reporting me for trespassing, threatening behavior, and refusing to leave her property. What she didn't know was that I was the police chief. Earlier that afternoon, road construction had blocked part of our street, forcing temporary driveway sharing. Notices were posted. Flyers were delivered. I followed every instruction exactly. Still, none of that mattered to her. In her mind, I didn't belong there. I calmly tried to explain, even gesturing toward the notice taped to her mailbox, but she waved me off and turned her back, speaking directly into her phone as she built a story that grew more dramatic by the second. Neighbors peeked through windows. Curtains moved. Someone started recording from across the street. The tension felt heavy, like the whole block was holding its breath. She paced back and forth, confident, almost smug, repeating that the police would handle me. She smiled when she said it, as if the outcome was already decided. I stood quietly beside my car, hands visible, heart steady. I had two choices: reveal who I was and end this instantly, or stay silent and let the process work the same way it would for anyone else. I chose silence. Authority means nothing if you only use it when it benefits you. The distant wail of sirens finally broke the standoff. Her posture straightened. Her smile widened. She crossed her arms and looked at me with pure satisfaction. I adjusted my jacket and watched the patrol cars turn onto the street, lights flashing, neighbors stepping closer to watch. What happened next didn't just shock her. It exposed how fast confidence collapses when it collides with truth. That single 911 call set off a chain of events that would leave her stunned, embarrassed, and completely unprepared for what the officers were about to discover, right there in front of everyone. And this was only the beginning of a night that would spiral far beyond a driveway argument, pulling in witnesses, recordings, consequences, and a truth she never imagined facing. By the time the officers stepped out of their cars and looked at me closely, the power she thought she held was already slipping away, and the realization that followed would be impossible to undo. Everything changed in seconds, and nothing afterward would ever feel the same again. The patrol car doors opened, and the mood on the street shifted instantly. Officer Ramirez stepped out first, scanning the scene with the calm focus of someone trained to read tension quickly. Officer Cole followed, already listening as the woman rushed toward them, talking over herself, pointing at me like I was proof of some serious crime. She spoke fast and loud, clearly confident. She claimed I had parked illegally. She said I refused to leave. She insisted she felt threatened and wanted me arrested immediately. I stayed where I was, hands relaxed at my sides, saying nothing. Years in law enforcement teach you that the truth reveals itself best when you don't interrupt the lie. I watched the officer's eyes move between her, me, the driveway, and the surroundings. They were doing exactly what they were trained to do. Then Officer Ramirez looked at me again, more carefully this time. I saw the recognition before he spoke. His eyebrows lifted slightly, and his steps slowed. "Chief," he said, uncertainty and surprise mixing in his voice. Officer Cole turned sharply, eyes widening as he took a closer look at my face. The entire street went silent. Even the woman stopped talking for a split second. She laughed nervously, shaking her head. She said they were mistaken. She accused me of lying, insisting criminals pretend to be police all the time. Her voice rose again as she tried to regain control of the moment. But control was already slipping away. Officer Ramirez calmly radioed dispatch to confirm my identity. The response came back almost instantly, clear and undeniable. My name. My position. My address. Each word landed like a weight. The woman's face drained of color. Her phone lowered slightly, frozen in her hand, like she didn't know what to do with it anymore. Officer Cole asked her to explain the situation again, slowly this time. She tried, but her story changed. Details shifted. Timelines didn't match. Her earlier confidence dissolved into frustration and fear. Ramirez walked over to the mailbox and pulled off the construction notice still taped there. He read it aloud, word for word, confirming everything I had calmly tried to explain earlier. Neighbors began stepping closer now, murmuring among themselves. One man spoke up, saying he'd watched the entire interaction and that I never raised my voice. Another nodded in agreement. The version of events she had created was unraveling in real time. I finally spoke, explaining that I hadn't identified myself on purpose. I wanted the situation handled fairly, without favors or pressure. The officers nodded. They already understood where this was going. That was when Ramirez turned to her and explained, very clearly, the consequences of making a false 911 call. The word consequences seemed to echo. Her hands started to shake. The power she thought she had vanished, replaced by a reality she never expected to face. The moment Officer Ramirez finished explaining what a false 911 call actually meant, I could see the shift happen inside her. The confidence drained from her face, replaced by panic she couldn't hide anymore. She started talking again, faster this time, her words tumbling over each other as she tried to undo what she had already said. She claimed the dispatcher misunderstood her. She said she was emotional. She insisted she never meant to accuse me of anything serious. But the truth doesn't rewind. Officer Cole turned the patrol car's speaker slightly, and the recorded 911 call played back into the open air. Her own voice echoed across the driveway, clear and undeniable. The words aggressive, refusing to leave, and I feel threatened cut through the silence. A few neighbors shifted uncomfortably. One shook his head slowly. There was no arguing with the recording. She tried to interrupt, saying that wasn't what she meant, that she was scared in the moment. Officer Ramirez calmly held up his hand and explained that intent matters, but statements matter more. Emergency calls are taken seriously because lives depend on them. Exaggerations don't stay small once they enter the system. When asked why she didn't read the notice on her mailbox or simply speak to me, she hesitated. The pause stretched just long enough to say everything. Then she snapped back defensively, saying she shouldn't have to share space with someone she didn't trust. The implication hung heavy in the air, and this time, no one defended her. The issue was no longer a driveway. It was judgment. Ramirez informed her she would be cited for misuse of emergency services and filing a false report. He explained the process carefully, step by step, as required. Citation. Documentation. Court date. Her shoulders slumped as reality settled in. The phone dropped to her side. The performance was over. I watched quietly, not with satisfaction, but with a familiar sadness. I had seen this pattern too many times during my career. People believe authority will automatically side with them. They don't expect evidence to matter. They don't expect accountability to arrive so quickly. As paperwork was completed, another neighbor stepped forward and confirmed, again, that I had remained calm the entire time. Others nodded in agreement. No one argued anymore. The truth no longer needed protection. When the citation was handed to her, she stared at it as if it were written in a foreign language. She turned without a word and walked slowly back toward her house, no longer angry, no longer powerful, just painfully aware that one impulsive call had changed her night completely. The patrol car lights dimmed. The officers asked if I was all right. I nodded, knowing this moment wouldn't end when the street went quiet. What had started in a driveway was about to follow her far beyond it, in ways she hadn't even begun to understand yet. When the patrol cars finally pulled away, the street felt unnaturally quiet, like the air itself was processing what had just happened. The flashing lights disappeared around the corner, but the tension they left behind lingered. Neighbors slowly retreated into their homes, doors closing softly, conversations reduced to whispers behind windows. What had started as a simple parking dispute had turned into something none of us would forget. I stood alone in my driveway for a moment, staring at the spot where my car was parked. I'd handled far more dangerous situations in my career, but this one felt heavier in a different way. This was home. This was supposed to be the place where the uniform came off and life slowed down. Instead, it had become a public lesson in how quickly assumptions can spiral into serious consequences. Across the street, her house went dark. No porch light. No movement. No apology. I didn't expect one. Embarrassment has a way of locking people behind closed doors. Still, silence doesn't erase actions. It just gives them space to echo. Inside my house, I set my keys on the counter and finally allowed myself to exhale. My phone buzzed almost immediately. Messages from officers, supervisors, and a few friends who had already heard pieces of the story. I answered briefly, making one thing clear every time: everything was handled by the book. No special treatment. No shortcuts. That mattered more than comfort. Later, I stepped back outside to check the mail. The construction notice was still taped to the mailbox, fluttering slightly in the night breeze. A simple piece of paper that could have prevented everything. I stared at it longer than necessary, thinking about how often conflict starts not from facts, but from assumptions people never bother to check. The more I replayed the evening, the more I realized how easily it could have gone wrong. A raised voice. A defensive move. A different officer responding with incomplete information. The line between calm resolution and chaos is thinner than most people realize. That's why accuracy matters. That's why restraint matters. As police chief, I had spoken countless times about misuse of emergency services. That night turned theory into reality. A false 911 call isn't harmless. It pulls officers away from real emergencies. It escalates situations that never needed to exist. And once made, it can't be undone. Before heading inside for the night, I looked down the street one last time. Everything looked normal again. Quiet. Ordinary. But I knew better. That driveway had become a reminder, not just for her, but for everyone watching, that accountability doesn't knock politely. It arrives when truth is tested, and it leaves marks that last far longer than flashing lights. By the next morning, the incident had already traveled beyond our street. Not through news headlines or social media, but through quiet conversations, phone calls, and text messages passed between neighbors. In a community like ours, flashing lights don't go unnoticed, and neither does embarrassment. I knew the situation would eventually reach my office in an official capacity, and I made sure it did. As police chief, I requested a formal internal review. Some people might think that was unnecessary, but for me, it was essential. Accountability has to start at the top, or it means nothing. Body camera footage, the 911 recording, witness statements, and the construction notices were all gathered and reviewed carefully. Everything was examined the same way it would be if I were a stranger, not the person in charge. The review confirmed what had already been obvious. The responding officers followed protocol perfectly. The call was false. The response was appropriate. No rules were bent, and no favors were given. That mattered deeply to me. Trust in law enforcement doesn't come from power. It comes from consistency. For her, however, the reality was just beginning to sink in. The citation she received wasn't just a warning. It came with a court date. The recorded call left little room for explanation or excuses. Words spoken in anger don't disappear just because regret arrives later. Once they're on record, they carry weight. That afternoon, a small envelope appeared in my office mailbox. No name. No return address. Inside was a short handwritten note. It wasn't dramatic or defensive. Just a few lines acknowledging poor judgment, fear, and embarrassment. She wrote that she never imagined things would go that far. Most people don't. That's often the problem. I folded the note and placed it in my desk drawer. Apologies don't erase consequences, but they do matter. They show awareness. Whether that awareness would lead to real change was something only time would reveal. What surprised me most was the ripple effect. Neighbors became more willing to talk things out instead of escalating. Officers reported fewer unnecessary calls from the area. One incident, handled correctly, had quietly changed behavior. That's what accountability looks like when it's visible. It doesn't humiliate. It corrects. I didn't take satisfaction in her situation. Consequences aren't about winning. They're about preventing the next mistake, the next false call, the next unnecessary escalation. That driveway argument was never really about parking. It was about power, perception, and the moment when truth refuses to bend. As the days passed, I realized this wasn't just her lesson. It was a reminder to everyone, including me, that the system only works when it's respected. And respect, once lost, is far harder to rebuild than it is to break. By the end of that week, I realized staying silent would do more harm than good. Stories like this grow teeth when they're left alone, shaped by rumor instead of facts. So I chose to address it openly, not to defend myself, but to protect trust. At a scheduled community meeting, I stood in front of a room filled with familiar faces, some curious, some uncomfortable, all listening closely. I told the story plainly. No names. No dramatics. Just exactly what happened. I explained the construction notice, the driveway confusion, the 911 call, and the outcome. I emphasized why misuse of emergency services is dangerous, how it diverts resources, and how quickly situations can escalate when false information enters the system. The room stayed quiet, the kind of silence that means people are absorbing every word. Then I addressed the part most people were thinking about but hadn't asked. I confirmed that Internal Affairs had reviewed the incident completely. Body cameras. Audio recordings. Witness statements. Everything. I made it clear that my actions were reviewed the same way anyone else's would be. Accountability, I said, doesn't work if leadership stands above it. It works only when leadership stands inside it. That's when I noticed a shift. People relaxed. Some nodded. A few exchanged glances. Trust doesn't rebuild with speeches, but honesty helps. After the meeting, several residents approached me quietly. One admitted they'd almost called the police over a neighbor dispute and thought better of it after hearing my story. Another thanked me for not escalating that night. Those conversations mattered more than applause ever could. The woman wasn't there, but later that evening, her attorney contacted the department to confirm she would comply fully with the court process. No excuses. No counterclaims. Just acceptance. That alone told me the lesson had landed harder than any public confrontation ever would. Over the next few days, the effects became visible in small ways. Officers reported fewer unnecessary calls. Neighbors communicated directly instead of reaching for authority. The system worked exactly as it should when people respected it. That night in my driveway reminded me why restraint matters more than power. Anyone can force an outcome. It takes discipline to allow fairness to unfold naturally. Leadership isn't proven when things go smoothly. It's proven when emotions run high and restraint still wins. Moments like this don't just test individuals. They test communities. They reveal whether people choose understanding or dominance, patience or impulse. That choice determines whether trust grows or fractures. As I left the meeting, I knew the story was no longer just mine. It had become a shared reminder that truth doesn't need volume, authority doesn't need intimidation, and accountability doesn't need anger to make its point. Sometimes, the quiet lesson lasts the longest. Weeks passed, and the incident slowly faded from daily conversation, but it never fully left my mind. Some lessons don't disappear with time, they settle in quietly and change how people behave. I noticed it during patrol briefings, where officers spoke more deliberately about de-escalation. I noticed it in the neighborhood, where small disputes were handled face to face instead of through authority. That night in my driveway had shifted something subtle but real. Then one afternoon, I saw her again. It was at a local grocery store, the kind of place where people avoid eye contact and rush through aisles. I was reaching for a basket when I felt that unmistakable pause, like someone deciding whether to run or speak. I turned and saw her standing a few steps away, frozen. Gone was the anger, the raised phone, the certainty. She looked smaller somehow, weighed down by weeks of reflection. For a moment, neither of us moved. I could have walked past her. Professionally and personally, I didn't owe her anything. But leadership doesn't end when it's inconvenient. Often, it shows up exactly when avoidance would be easier. I nodded politely. That was all it took. She swallowed and apologized. Not rushed. Not defensive. Just quiet and direct. She said she had replayed that night over and over, realizing how quickly fear and assumptions had taken control. She admitted embarrassment, not just about the citation, but about how publicly wrong she had been. Her voice shook, but she didn't stop talking. She needed to say it. I listened. I didn't interrupt. I didn't minimize what happened, and I didn't shame her either. I told her that apologies matter, but accountability matters more. I reminded her that false accusations don't just affect one person. They strain systems, endanger others, and leave marks that don't show up on paperwork. She nodded, eyes down, understanding finally settling in. We didn't shake hands. We didn't offer forgiveness or closure wrapped neatly in words. We simply acknowledged the moment for what it was, then went our separate ways. Sometimes, that's enough. Driving home, I thought about how consequences extend far beyond court dates and fines. They live in uncomfortable encounters, quiet reflection, and the slow rebuilding of trust. That's where real change happens, not under flashing lights, but in everyday moments no one records. Not everyone who misuses authority reflects afterward. Many double down. But when reflection does happen, it deserves space to work. That encounter reminded me why restraint matters more than humiliation. Why dignity, even when undeserved, can sometimes open the door to growth. That driveway incident was never about winning or losing. It was about truth meeting power and showing which one actually holds weight. And sometimes, the most meaningful outcomes happen long after the noise is gone, when accountability finally has room to sink in. After that encounter, I found myself thinking about the badge in a way I hadn't before. For most people, it represents authority, safety, or fear, depending on their experiences. For me, that night redefined it as responsibility in its purest form. Not the kind you display, but the kind that follows you home, stands with you in your driveway, and tests who you are when no one expects you to be on duty. I began sharing the story quietly during academy sessions, carefully removing names and locations. Recruits leaned forward as I explained how quickly a routine call can become dangerous when false information enters the system. I told them how officers rely on accuracy for their safety, how assumptions can escalate tension, and how ego is often more dangerous than any weapon on the street. Professionalism, I reminded them, isn't proven during dramatic arrests. It's proven when someone lies about you and you still choose restraint. Those rooms always grew quiet. They understood this wasn't theory. This was real. I also became more intentional in community interactions. I listened longer. I explained more. I recognized that for many people, fear speaks louder than facts. That doesn't excuse misuse of authority, but it does explain why patience matters. Systems only work when people trust them, and trust isn't built through force. It's built through consistency and transparency. One evening, weeks later, I stood in the same driveway watching kids ride bikes and neighbors talk casually. The street looked peaceful again, almost forgetful of what had happened. But I knew how fragile that calm was. All it takes is one assumption, one emotional decision, one phone call made without reflection, and everything fractures. The badge doesn't make someone right. The law doesn't exist to validate feelings. Truth is the anchor that keeps situations from drifting into chaos. That night proved that when the system works as intended, it protects everyone, even when the outcome is uncomfortable. I never told this story to embarrass anyone. I tell it to remind people, officers and civilians alike, that authority is not a shortcut to being correct. It's a responsibility to be careful, fair, and honest. Abuse it, and the system pushes back hard. Respect it, and it protects everyone equally. That woman tried to use the police as leverage in a personal conflict. Instead, the moment became a mirror, reflecting character, accountability, and consequence. Not loudly. Not violently. But clearly. Standing there in my driveway, long after the noise had faded, I understood something deeply. Power fades. Titles change. But the way you handle truth when it challenges you, that stays. And that, more than any rank or uniform, is what the badge is really supposed to represent, every single day, whether anyone is watching or not. Looking back now, I understand why that night stayed with me longer than most incidents in my career. It wasn't dramatic in the way people expect. There were no handcuffs, no shouting match, no viral moment caught perfectly on camera. Instead, it revealed something far more important about power, truth, and the choices people make when emotions take control. The driveway itself never mattered. It was just concrete. What mattered was the belief that authority could be summoned like a weapon, that a phone call could replace facts, and that confidence alone could bend the system. That belief collapsed the moment truth entered the scene. Not loudly. Not aggressively. Just steadily, piece by piece. I still park in that same spot every night. Every time I do, I'm reminded that leadership isn't proven in offices, titles, or meetings. It's proven in moments when you're falsely accused and choose patience anyway. When you could end a situation instantly but allow the process to work as it should. That restraint matters more than rank ever will. The officers who responded that night did exactly what they were trained to do. They listened. They verified. They followed procedure without bias. No shortcuts. No assumptions. That consistency is what separates justice from chaos. When people see the system applied evenly, even uncomfortable outcomes become easier to accept. For anyone hearing this story, here's the part that matters most. Before you reach for authority, reach for understanding. Before you call for power, ask yourself whether you're prepared for the consequences if you're wrong. Emergency services are not customer support. They are a lifeline. Misusing them doesn't just affect one person. It affects everyone who might need help while resources are tied up elsewhere. That woman didn't face consequences because of who I was. She faced consequences because her story couldn't stand up to the truth. Titles fade. Uniforms change. But facts remain. Truth doesn't rush. It doesn't argue. It waits. I didn't share this story for praise or sympathy. I shared it as a reminder that accountability isn't punishment. It's correction. It's how systems stay strong and communities stay safe. When honesty leads, power follows the right path. That night could have gone differently. It could have escalated. Someone could have been hurt. Instead, it became a lesson visible to everyone watching, including me. A lesson about restraint, humility, and the quiet strength of letting truth speak for itself. If this story stays with you, let it be for that reason. Not the meltdown. Not the shock. But the reminder that truth doesn't need volume to win. It only needs time. And in the end, time always exposes what power alone never can.